No one ever truly knows when a world war begins. There is never a headline that says, "Today at 1407, humanity crossed the line." Global wars are not announced in advance. They form out of a chain of events that, on ordinary days, look random, local, insignificant. But then, in one single instant, something happens that can no longer be ignored. And that moment is always sudden. That morning was no different from any other. The world lived in its usual chaos. Some argued on social media, others drove to work, someone brewed coffee, someone opened another trading session. Everything seemed ordinary until 09:26 a.m., when every television channel and smartphone screamed with an emergency alert tone most people had only ever heard in disaster movies. And in 1 second, the planet went silent. A message appeared on the screen. Unlike the usual warnings about weather, earthquakes, or industrial accidents. No forecasts, no local updates, just one phrase. The global security network has detected coordinated strikes in multiple regions. Stay alert. What happened next entered history as the darkest hour of the 21st century. First came reports of massive cyber attacks that paralyzed financial centers, New York, London, Tokyo, as if someone switched off the lights in the three hearts of the global economy simultaneously. Then, several communication satellites went offline. Their trajectories abruptly shifted, and within minutes, navigation systems stopped transmitting signals. What seemed like a slow internet connection turned out to be the deliberate shutdown of communication grids. For years, military analysts had predicted this. The Third World War would begin not with nuclear mushrooms, but with silence. A silence in which the technologies we depend on simply stop working. And now that silence had covered the planet. 7 minutes after the first reports, the world heard what it feared most. Scientists confirmed multiple hypersonic launches had been detected from different regions. Their trajectories were still unknown, but their speed was unmistakable. No one was asking what's happening anymore. Only one question remained: where are they headed? Schools activated their emergency sirens. In subways, people froze with their phones in hand. Cars came to a sudden stop on highways as drivers stepped out, trying to understand where the alarm was coming from. Urban streets flickered red with warning signals. Across government centers on every continent, underground command bunkers began to open. What had been called rhetoric just a day earlier had become reality. Missile defense systems moved to full combat readiness. Somewhere, strategic bombers were already taking off. Somewhere deep underwater, in absolute darkness, nuclear submarines received encrypted codes everyone had hoped they would never hear. If the stock markets were still functioning, panic would have erupted instantly. But the markets were silent. The internet had collapsed. Millions sat in front of black screens, not knowing whether it was a system overload, an attack, or the beginning of the end. Social media went down first, then messaging apps. 10 minutes later, most commercial websites vanished. People turned to radio, a technology long considered outdated. And radio delivered the message that threw entire nations into shock. Martial law had been declared in several major countries. No one yet knew who started it, but one thing was clear. Whoever started it, everyone else now was pulled into the game. Forces were already mobilized. Diplomacy had failed, and the world had entered a new era where every hesitation carried consequences. In cities, crowds stormed stores. Some bought water, some batteries, some just ran without a purpose.
In several countries, the military deployed armored vehicles to maintain order. The air itself felt unstable, as if any action was too late, yet any inaction was deadly. Within the first minutes, the entire world understood this was no drill. This was the very scenario feared for decades. And now every person had to decide what to do in order to survive the next 24 hours. Between panic and shock, between the last news broadcast and growing silence, the main question emerged: what happens now? What should you do in the first minutes, the first hour, the first day when your reality collapses in real time? The first 24 hours would determine who survives and who doesn't, who makes the right decisions and who falls into chaos. Because the world we woke up to today is no longer the same world, and what you do next will be the most important sequence of actions in your life.
The first hour after the coordinated strikes would later be analyzed in thousands of reports, commissions, classified documents, and documentaries. But in those first moments, no one had time to think about history. They were thinking only about survival. The world had become a maze of misinformation, broken communication lines, and half-understood signals, and every decision made now would ripple outward, shaping the next hours and possibly the fate of entire nations. What became clear almost immediately was that the global information landscape had split into fragments. Without stable internet, the world no longer shared a common narrative. In one region, people heard that a major city had been hit. In another, that this was only a cyber attack. Somewhere, a rumor spread that nuclear weapons had already been detonated. Elsewhere, officials downplayed the situation, insisting this was a temporary disruption. Information turned into a battlefield, just as real as the physical one. Inside government bunkers, leaders were receiving data that updated minute by minute, a mosaic of satellite detection logs, intercepted communications, and alerts from military sensors. Operators watched screens filled with maps that pulsed red with threat indicators. Analysts struggled to determine whether the hypersonic launches were decoys, tests, misfires, or actual weapons. Even the world's most advanced militaries found themselves blind in ways they believed impossible in the digital age. The very systems designed to withstand war were failing under the scale of the attack. In the cities, people instinctively reached for their phones, the modern equivalent of a lifeline. But smartphones had turned into useless rectangles of glass and metal. Apps could not connect. Calls dropped instantly. The last messages froze, half delivered. Some devices displayed only the warning that had triggered the global alarm. For the first time in decades, billions were forced to confront a terrifying reality. Without the digital grid, humanity was far more vulnerable than anyone had acknowledged. Hospitals switched to backup power within minutes. Without real-time communication, they had no idea if the sudden stream of emergency vehicles was the beginning of a mass casualty event or just panic. Doctors checked equipment manually. Nurses printed patient lists on the last working printers in case the power grid faltered again. In trauma centers across the world, the same question repeated quietly: are we preparing for wounded, or are we preparing for the unthinkable? Transportation systems were collapsing. Trains halted between stations. Planes circled anxiously above airports, awaiting instructions that would not come. Millions of cars clogged highways as people tried to reach family members or escape cities, although no one knew where safe was anymore. Traffic lights turned blank, plunging megacities into chaotic knots of metal and fear. Police departments received so many simultaneous calls that their networks overloaded and shut down. In some regions, officers switched to analog radios buried in storage since the early 2000s, the only devices still functioning. Meanwhile, far from public view, militaries across the planet were moving. Submarines surfaced to establish alternate radio links. Strategic bombers flew to pre-assigned safe zones,
Commanders initiated long, dormant protocols designed only for existential threats. And somewhere, deep inside a windowless operations room, a general signed a document authorizing full-spectrum defensive readiness, a phrase that in any other decade would have seemed like fiction. But the most dangerous part of the first hour was not military action. It was psychological collapse. The human mind is not built to process the sudden awareness that everything familiar can disappear. Panic became a contagion. In some cities, crowds moved as one, driven by a primal instinct to flee, though they did not know where. In others, people froze, unable to decide whether to stay indoors or run outside. Some turned on their TVs in hope of answers, only to see anchors speaking with trembling voices, reading statements that revealed more fear than information. A strange kind of calm settled over the world, but it was not peace, it was shock. The kind of stillness that happens before a storm breaks open. In rural areas, communities reacted differently. Without immediate reliance on digital systems, some villages and small towns remained eerily functional. Local radio stations broadcast updates more reliably than national networks. Neighbors gathered, pooling resources. These pockets of order would later become lifelines for thousands fleeing larger cities engulfed in chaos. In contrast, major metropolitan centers resembled something out of a dystopian novel. Sirens echoed through streets already crowded with people abandoning stalled transit systems. ATM machines stopped working, electronic payment systems froze. Supermarkets became flashpoints of panic as shelves emptied in minutes. The fragility of modern life, that everything depended on electricity, data, logistics, revealed itself brutally. Governments attempted to broadcast emergency instructions. Some managed to reach parts of their population through analog channels, advising citizens to gather water, move away from windows, stay indoors, and await further announcements. But these messages traveled slowly. Many arrived too late. Others contradicted what people were hearing from local authorities. And in many places, there were no messages at all, just silence. Across borders, nations tried to contact allies. Secure communication systems designed to withstand warfare had been compromised or degraded. Diplomats faced the possibility that any message they sent could be intercepted or misinterpreted. A single misunderstood command could trigger retaliation. And all the while, the world's nuclear arsenals sat on alert. Operators waited for orders with hands hovering over consoles capable of ending civilizations. But on ordinary people, teachers, engineers, baristas, students, found themselves confronting questions they had never imagined. Should they shelter in place? Should they run? Should they gather family or try to help neighbors? Every second of hesitation felt like gambling with fate. Some people turned to old survival manuals. Others remembered advice from documentaries and historical accounts of crises. Some had prepared for this, but they were the minority. Most were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the unknown. And yet, in the midst of chaos, one truth became increasingly clear. The first hour was not about understanding the situation. It was about positioning yourself to survive the next. The decisions made now, where to go, what to take, who to trust, would shape the next phase of the crisis. Because the first hour was only beginning, and the world had not yet seen the full extent of what was coming.
The world entered the most critical window in modern history. Every passing minute carved deeper lines between order and chaos, preparedness and desperation, survival and catastrophe. By the time the first hour had ended, the global situation had deteriorated to a point where even seasoned analysts struggled to describe what they were witnessing. But the next 23 hours were the true test, hours in which every individual decision carried weight far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. As the first hour gave way to the second, many regions experienced rolling blackouts.
Power grids synchronized through delicate networks could no longer maintain stability without continuous digital oversight. Entire neighborhoods plunged into darkness, broken only by the glow of candles, flashlights, or cars trapped at intersections. In many cities, the sky itself became a source of dread, not because of what was visible, but because of what might be arriving at hypersonic speed far above. Governments attempted to coordinate a global response, but communication links between world powers were fragile. Encrypted military channels flickered in and out. Some messages were delayed, others corrupted. Commanders feared issuing orders that might be misunderstood by systems already under digital attack. In strategy rooms, the unspoken fear was that a single misinterpretation could ignite retaliation, not because of aggression, but because of confusion. Civilian life, meanwhile, fractured into countless small stories of fear, instinct, and improvisation. In some cities, people formed instant groups, sharing food, water, and information. Strangers helped the elderly move to safer buildings. Parents gathered children into basements that had never been intended as shelters. But in other places, chaos intensified. Alarmed by empty shelves and failing banks, crowds turned desperate. With police overwhelmed and response times stretching into hours, local communities learned a painful truth. Security was no longer guaranteed. Among all this turmoil, millions faced the same terrifying realization that no one was coming to help them immediately. Emergency services were already exhausted. Hospitals were running low on fuel and backup power. Fire departments responded only to the most critical calls. And everywhere, the same question echoed in trembling voices: what do we do now? People who had never considered disaster preparedness suddenly found themselves forced to become experts in minutes. They searched their homes for flashlights, bottled water, canned food, radios, anything that could give them an edge. Those who still had functioning radios listened closely, desperate for guidance. Across many regions, emergency broadcast systems repeated the same message: stay off the roads, find a secure location away from windows, conserve resources, avoid panic. But each person interpreted that message differently. Some rushed to find relatives, others barricaded themselves inside apartments. Some left cities entirely, walking along highways as cars remained frozen in endless traffic jams. And far from urban centers, people living in rural areas began helping neighbors, forming improvised networks of information and support. Ironically, the places with the least technology became the most resilient. In parallel, military forces across the globe enacted the most significant mobilization since the dawn of the nuclear age. Defense satellites attempted to recalibrate. Air forces deployed aircraft to patrol borders. Naval fleets repositioned. Submarines held deep-water stations, maintaining radio silence while awaiting further orders. It was a global choreography of power, one misstep away from irreversible escalation. Inside hardened bunkers, analysts studied intercepted signals. Some hinted at further incoming strikes. Others suggested diplomatic attempts to stop the conflict. Still others were so heavily corrupted that no one could determine their meaning. Leaders struggled to make decisions with incomplete information, fearing that any action might provoke immediate retaliation. Meanwhile, the psychological landscape of the world transformed. The sense of unreality that had dominated the first hour slowly solidified into grim awareness. People began to understand that this was not a temporary outage or regional crisis. The shock faded, replaced by determination in some, fury in others, and a deep, sinking dread in many more. Children asked questions their parents could not answer.
Families huddled together in silence, listening for distant explosions or emergency announcements. As the hours progressed, the breakdown of digital infrastructure revealed how deeply modern civilization depended on fragile networks. Water pumps in some cities stopped functioning. Gas stations shut down because payment systems were offline. Heating systems in colder countries faltered without automated controls. Grocery stores without electricity were unable to preserve perishable food. And logistics networks, the invisible arteries that fed entire nations, froze as trucks sat immobilized without working navigation systems. In several regions, martial law took full effect. Military checkpoints appeared on major roads. Soldiers guarded critical infrastructure, though even they understood the limits of their control. Governments issued curfews, broadcasting orders through emergency speakers and radio channels. But not everyone heard them, not everyone trusted them, and not everyone complied. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed nuclear strikes had already occurred in distant countries. Others believed ceasefire negotiations were underway. Information became a luxury, available only to those with working radios or access to local officials. In the midst of this uncertainty, individuals faced personal crossroads. They had to decide where to shelter, whom to trust, what to prioritize. Some families left densely populated areas, walking through the night towards smaller towns. Others gathered neighbors to reinforce basements, turning storage rooms into makeshift bunkers. A few with medical training set up community aid stations, treating injuries caused by panic, accidents, or failed infrastructure. As dawn neared again, the world entered a strange, nearly silent rhythm. Humanity held its breath, waiting for news, any news that might reveal whether the worst had passed or was only beginning. The tension was suffocating. Even in cities known for constant noise, the streets were quiet, except for the occasional siren or the distant rumble of military vehicles. By hour 18, emergency responders in some regions began to regain partial coordination. A handful of hospitals established communication with military units, receiving updates on potential threats and evacuation routes. Fire departments restored limited radio contact. Electricity returned sporadically in certain districts. It was not stability, but it was a sign that collapse was not absolute. Still, the fear of new incoming strikes hung over every conversation. Governments warned citizens to prepare for possible further disruptions. The possibility of a second wave loomed, and no one knew whether the world was closer to escalation or de-escalation. By the 24th hour, humanity found itself transformed. Those who had panicked in the beginning were now calmer simply because they had grown numb. Those who had frozen were now acting with purpose. And those who had prepared, mentally or physically, were becoming anchors for everyone around them. The first day of World War III had not ended with clarity. It had ended with uncertainty, exhaustion, and an understanding that the world that existed before would never exist again. But for millions of people, the decisions they made in these first 24 hours had already determined their path forward, a path into a future no one had ever wanted to imagine.
The second day began not with explosions, but with an unsettling quietness that drifted across continents like a heavy fog. There was no sunrise in the emotional sense. The light merely revealed more of the same shattered reality the world had fallen into the day before. People woke with the same questions as they had when they closed their eyes, if anyone truly slept. What had happened in the night? Were more strikes launched? Was the danger growing or fading? And most urgently, who was still in control? In many cities, the air tasted metallic, not from radiation or debris, but from the deep collective tension that had settled over the population. Radios buzzed with incomplete transmissions. Some stations broadcast static, others repeated emergency messages recorded hours earlier. In places where electricity had partially returned, television screens displayed government spokespeople reading statements with pale faces, clearly exhausted by the pressure of being the world's remaining conduits of information. The global digital infrastructure, though damaged, was not entirely dead. Technicians worked relentlessly to restore core networks, often manually overriding automated systems that had been compromised. Fiber optic lines rerouted traffic. Backup satellites, some decades old, were reactivated to stabilize the remnants of international communication. But the reconnected fragments of the internet offered no comfort. Instead of clarity, they delivered raw, unfiltered chaos. Videos of burning buildings, crowds pushing against military barricades, political leaders issuing contradictory messages. False reports spread faster than verified ones, adding fuel to an already smoldering world. In capitals around the world, leaders gathered in emergency councils. Many spoke in whispers, aware that even within secure bunkers, no channel was entirely safe. Their conversations revolved around the same unanswerable questions. Who launched the initial hypersonic strikes? Were they followed by additional covert attacks? Was this a deliberate opening salvo of war, or an engineered cascade meant to trigger confusion and retaliation? Theories emerged as quickly as they were dismissed. Some claimed the attacks were the result of rogue states. Others believed they were coordinated by a coalition. Still others suspected advanced autonomous systems had been manipulated to initiate conflict. Each possibility was terrifying in its own way. Diplomats attempted to reach their counterparts, but many lines remained dead or heavily jammed. Even when contact was made, there was no guarantee that the person on the other end could verify their own country's situation with confidence. In several regions, militaries moved into full defensive posture. Anti-aircraft systems scanned the sky continuously. Fighter jets patrolled borders, refueled in the air, and returned to the sky again. Naval task forces formed protective rings around coastlines, and beneath the surface of the oceans, submarines maneuvered into positions designed for either deterrence or retaliation. No one could tell which. Meanwhile, on the ground, the human dimension of the crisis deepened. With supply chains disrupted and commercial transport crippled, shortages began to appear. The disappearance of fresh food was the first sign. The fuel shortage followed quickly. Gas stations still functioning could not process electronic payments. Long lines formed, stretching miles. As people waited in silence for a chance to fill their tanks, the most pumps ran dry within hours. In colder regions, heating systems began to fail. Families lit fireplaces, burned scrap wood, or huddled under blankets. Hospitals rationed medical supplies, prioritizing patients who could be saved with the least resources. Social fabric, fragile even in ordinary times, started to tear. In some cities, people helped one another, sharing meals, clearing debris, and checking on neighbors. In others, fear turned to anger and anger to violence. Looting erupted sporadically. Not everywhere, but enough to deepen the sense of crisis. Police forces already stretched thin struggled to maintain control. Some officers abandoned their posts to protect their own families. Others stayed, knowing that if they weren't there, order might collapse entirely. Amid the chaos, a troubling pattern emerged. Several nations reported that large segments of their military satellite networks had been temporarily blinded. Though the interference lessened over time, the damage had already been done. Commanders were unsure whether additional missile launches were imminent. The fear of a second wave hung over every operational center like a ghost. And then came the message, the first glimmer of something resembling clarity. A series of coordinated transmissions reached multiple major powers through encrypted analog channels. The message contained 3 critical points: a call for immediate de-escalation, a warning that further action could trigger irreversible catastrophe, and a request for an emergency summit to be held in a neutral location. The transmissions bore the hallmarks of a major global power, but the identity of the sender remained ambiguous. Some believed the message was genuine.
Others feared it was a trap designed to gain time or sow further confusion. Despite uncertainty, many leaders recognized the necessity of communication. Silence in this moment was more dangerous than words. Plans were made to establish a minimum channel of dialogue, a fragile lifeline through which nations could confirm intentions and reduce the risk of misinterpretation. The world teetered between escalation and restraint, and even the smallest misunderstanding could push it over the edge. While governments debated, ordinary people faced their own crossroads. Some attempted to flee cities entirely, forming caravans of cars moving slowly across highways littered with abandoned vehicles. Others fortified their homes, gathering supplies and preparing for longer-term disruption. A few found refuge in improvised community shelters, underground parking structures, basements of schools, and industrial warehouses transformed into refugee zones. As evening settled on the second day, the world experienced a moment unlike any in its modern history. The sky was quiet. The streets were dim. The air carried a nervous stillness. People listened not for news, but for sounds, sirens, aircraft, explosions, anything that might signal the direction the world was heading. Governments waited for confirmation about the proposed summit. Military commanders monitored incoming data streams, searching for signs of new threats. Families clung to radios, praying for messages of hope. And scientists tracking global sensor networks feared that the next hours would determine whether the crisis moved toward dialogue or disaster. The world was balanced on a knife's edge. One message, one action, one miscalculation would decide everything.
By the third day, the world had begun to reckon with the scale of what had happened. The initial shock, which had paralyzed governments, militaries, and civilians alike, was giving way to a stark awareness. The universe had not shifted overnight, but human systems had. The networks, the infrastructure, the assumptions of safety, all were fractured, and the consequences of every action or inaction were now magnified beyond imagination. In capitals around the globe, leaders finally established the minimum channels of communication promised the day before. A fragile dialogue began between nations that had been on the brink of confrontation. Intelligence analysts confirmed the first waves of strikes were largely non-lethal, a calculated display of capability rather than mass destruction. Hypersonic launches, cyber attacks, and satellite manipulations had tested response times, coordination, and human resilience. It was, in a terrifying sense, a warning. The world had stepped to the edge of a knife and could have fallen. For civilians, the reality was far grimmer. Water, food, fuel, and medical supplies remained scarce in urban centers. Power grids flickered on and off. Public transportation was still unreliable. Panic, fatigue, and fear had transformed communities. In cities, a new rhythm emerged. People moved cautiously, relying on each other for information, protection, and survival. In rural areas, where networks had failed less dramatically, small communities had become sanctuaries of stability. These pockets of resilience provided the first glimmers of hope. Military forces remained on alert, but restraint was slowly taking hold. Nuclear arsenals, once poised on hair-trigger alert, were held in check by clear, cautious communication. Commanders realized the magnitude of miscalculation. Any misstep could trigger an irreversible chain of events. And yet, every new report, a satellite anomaly, an unidentified aircraft, a suspicious cyber intrusion, reignited tension across command centers. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued to adapt. Streets that had once been sites of chaos now resembled controlled zones. Volunteers organized relief efforts. Neighborhood groups established local rules of safety. Some families evacuated to smaller towns. Others fortified their homes against both the elements and potential violence. Across the globe, a profound human truth emerged. In the absence of certainty, cooperation and quick thinking became the most valuable tools. The emergency summit, convened in a neutral location under maximum security, became the focal point of hope and anxiety. Leaders met, guarded by layers of military protection, aware that the slightest misstep could reignite the crisis.
For the first time since the strikes, there was a shared understanding. The world had been tested and survived, but it had been pushed closer to catastrophe than anyone realized. Negotiations were painstaking. Every gesture, every statement, every tone was scrutinized. Mistrust lingered, but the human instinct for survival created a tentative bridge. Agreements emerged slowly. Communication channels would be restored, partial demobilizations initiated, humanitarian corridors established. While fragile, these measures signaled a chance for stability, a proof that even amid unprecedented chaos, deliberate action could steer the course away from total destruction. In the streets, the dawn of the fourth day brought an eerie mixture of relief and vigilance. People moved cautiously, testing the limits of a world no longer entirely controlled by technology. Radios broadcast updates, small generators powered essential services. Curfews remained in effect, but communities slowly learned to navigate the new normal. Survival depended not on fear alone, but on observation, foresight, and cooperation. The events of the first days had left an indelible mark. Humanity had been reminded of its vulnerabilities, the fragility of complex systems, the volatility of global politics, the unpredictability of technology, and the unpredictability of human reaction. Yet it had also revealed resilience, the capacity to organize, to adapt, to survive under unimaginable pressure. By the fifth day, the initial global panic had receded into memory, replaced by an understanding that this was the new reality. The first 24 hours, then the subsequent days, had separated the prepared from the unprepared, the proactive from the passive, and the adaptive to the paralyzed. And while the threat of further escalation remained, one truth became unmistakable. The decisions of individuals and nations within those first critical days had already shaped the trajectory of the world. The Earth, scarred but still standing, entered a precarious new chapter. Humanity had glimpsed the edge of annihilation and stepped back. For some, the lessons of those first hours would define their survival forever. For others, the memory of fear would linger, a shadow over the choices of the days to come. And for all, the world would never again feel completely secure, but the awareness of its fragility offered a chance to rebuild, reimagine, and redefine what it meant to survive together. Because history had shifted, not through the flash of bombs or the roar of weapons, but through the quiet courage, instinct, and decisive actions of millions in the very first hours of a world teetering on the brink.